Chapter 2. Difficulty. James Potter was very confused. It had started out a fairly normal day. Well, not normal but fairly regular. Saturday had been terribly dramatic. Of course. After all, you couldn't exactly consider a horrendous attack and fighting Dark Lord Voldemort ordinary. And James still vividly remembered when Barton had died. The smudges under the young man's eyes were evidence enough that the previous evening hadn't been as restful as needed. But it was Monday, and while gossip still raged with tales of what had happened in Hogsmeade, and quite a few things that hadn't, life was getting back to normal. James had done his homework. He'd gone to class. He had even managed to get into yet another ridiculous fight with Lily, over Merlin knew what this time. Something about how it was wrong to prank gossiping third years even if they were spreading some foolish story about Barton being alive and recovering in St. Mungo's. Lying little prats. So the last thing he'd expected when he'd left the Gryffindor Tower for dinner was to be mobbed by a crowd of Aurors and a dozen members of the press. That's him. A voice shouted out as soon as he stepped onto the lower flight of stairs. James blinked as a flash went off, momentarily blinding him. He looked behind him wondering who they were talking about, but all he saw was Flister Cornsworth. And, well, James had to admit that he was certainly more worthy of mob worship than Flister. But that was silly. Excuse me, James said, deciding to ignore the crowd and try to get to the Great Hall. He'd been delayed already by some prank items gone awry and he was eager to get to his friends and a little shepherd's pie. Just stand there, one of the photographers called. And James did, very dumbly, in a dazed sort of way. Several more flashes exploded and the spots of light blinded him so much that any sort of stair-climbing maneuver would have been life-threatening. What's going on? James asked. The crowd grew even tighter when an Auror in blue robes approached James and started pumping his hand, smiling and waving to the cameras while doing so. Just great work, James. James craned his neck to try and figure out who exactly was congratulating him. Eventually the man turned from the flashing cameras enough that James was able to recognize Auror Filibuster. Not a particularly noteworthy man. He'd probably never worked in the field, and was more known for handing out plaques at press conferences and the like. He had given James's own father an award only last year for 50 years in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Tell us, Mr. Potter, a scrawny man with a stubby moustache shouted, why did you stand up against the Dark Lord? James wondered why anyone would ask that question. Filibuster's booming voice took over the lull. Well, as I'm sure James would tell you, it's every good Englishman's duty to stand against this criminal, this villain of the wizarding world. You're only a sixth year. Did you fear for your life? A woman with tight blonde curls asked, elbowing her way to the front. I guess, James said, bravery personified, the best example of young men today. Filibuster's voice carried high over the heads of the reporters and the photographers eagerly snapped another shot of the Auror slapping James on the back and offering a very cheesy thumbs up. There must be some mistake, James said to the Auror, trying to block the reporters from their conversation. Mistake? Filibuster said quietly. You are James Potter, aren't you? Defender of Hogsmeade. Classy title, that's just it. I didn't defend anyone. Well, not really. I shot off a few curses shot off a few curses. Filibuster was projecting his voice again. And he's modest, too, the man claimed, once again turning James back toward the front. Why didn't you step forward in Hogsmeade? Are the rumors true that certain shop owners may be pressing charges? The voice was lost in the muffled shouts of other reporters putting in their opinions. What? James asked. He vaguely remembered some reporters in Hogsmeade and somehow avoiding them did sound familiar. He scratched his head. This was starting to not make a lot of sense. Had he hit his head? James looked around, suddenly wondering if this was some prank Padfoot had concocted. Nor, he wasn't smart enough to pull something like this off. Is it true that you stole a camera belonging to a Daily Prophet photographer? A new voice chimed in, managing to rise above the rest. James shook his head. Maybe he should see Madame Pomfrey. Filibuster seemed to take the sudden public shift with the confidence of a raging rhinoceros. A muttered roar seemed to emanate from his body and the reporters present all stilled under the noise, shifting their quills and pads of paper nervously. Now, what we have here folks is a modest, hard-working, brave English wizard. A hero really, from a long line of good-hearted folk. You all know how his father earned an Order of Merlin, 3rd class, for his action against Grindelwald. And the apple didn't fall far from the tree. Young James here stepped in and saved a lot of lives, and we should all be thankful. The wizard swallowed nervously, as if any expression of ungratefulness were a form of treason. Of course the lad was a little confused, a little nervous. Can't blame him for wanting to get back to the castle for medical treatment. A lad like him wouldn't want to take the glory he deserves. James knew that somewhere Lily Evans was laughing her well-proportioned arse off with all this talk of his modesty and selflessness. Now, the Aurora Division of the Magical Law Enforcement wants to extend its gratitude to this fine young man, and hope that someday he decides to join our numbers. We'll have a spot for someone like him. Filibuster threw an arm around James's shoulder and once again the cameras flashed excitedly. "Excuse me," an amused voice interrupted. Albus Dumbledore descended the stairs and stood protectively behind James. "Aurora Filibuster, good to see you," the headmaster said kindly. "We can speak in my office. Perhaps your friends would like to leave now. This is a school and not the proper time or place for a press conference." The members of the press muttered rebelliously, but Filibuster waved a casual hand, dismissing them without argument. The two young recruits who had followed him moved to help direct the press from the grounds. Having lost their ministry protector, the adult witches and wizards moved en masse toward the doors, summing up their thoughts on their little pads of paper as they left. "Professor," James said in confusion, hoping that the headmaster could explain to him what might have caused this mess. "Let me have a moment to speak to Mr. Filibuster, Mr. Potter. You have some dinner and then we can discuss this afterward. There is some lovely chocolate pudding tonight." James moved toward the great hall and then paused for a moment. He turned to make certain that he was out of the headmaster's sight before ducking into a secret passageway and dashing up a few stairs and emerging on the 4th floor. It was near enough to the headmaster's office and James ducked behind a tapestry to wait for Dumbledore and Filibuster to go by. The spokesman for the Auras was a short man. His blonde hair had gone grey on the temples and his lack of fieldwork left him a little heavier of build than some of his colleagues. But he had the same straight bearing that James had become accustomed to when meeting an Auror. His own father's posture was so straight it could be used in place of a level. Dumbledore towered over the other man, and his slower steps seemed to contrast with Filibuster's more purposeful gait. The younger Auror had to drop back to keep pace with the headmaster, but any frustration from this was hidden by a genial face. "Oh, never mind," Filibuster was saying as they emerged. "They got what they needed. Vultures, always trying to make everything into a bad thing. About this, Stephen," Dumbledore said gently, "why does the ministry seem to have it in their heads that one of my 6th-year students did battle with Voldemort? I've received no less than 20 owls today trying to arrange a time to speak with young Mr. Potter." Filibuster grunted before arching his lips into a grin and shaking his head. "Notice you didn't reply," he commented. "Had to take action. The wizarding world wants a hero after all, and young James did fight the Dark Lord. Nearly bested him at that." Dumbledore paused. "I find that difficult to believe. While young Mr. Potter is a formidable wizard, he hasn't yet reached a point where he could," but he was seen. Filibuster interrupted. "People in Hogsmeade pointed him out. Dark messy hair, glasses, same build as young James, and it wasn't difficult to spot him for a Potter. Almost the spitting image of his father. Potter blood, no getting out of it." He chuckled, shaking his head. "He's a wily bugger, though. Transfigured one of his mates to look like him to cause confusion. There is modesty and stupidity, and the boy has one in spades, not certain which." Dumbledore paused. "Still, I find the matter a bit confusing." The conversation became difficult to hear as the two turned the corner that would lead him to the headmaster's gargoyle. James dusted himself as he pulled back from behind the tapestry of Franklin the Curious. He removed his glasses and cast a cleaning charm on him as he considered what he had overheard. Nearly bested the Dark Lord. Hardly. James liked to think that he had held his own. He'd tossed a few spells, kept the Dark Lord on his toes. James reached up and rubbed his forehead tiredly. No, he hadn't. He'd been a mild annoyance. Sirius had more of a hand in fighting Voldemort. It had been nothing like the games he'd played. It hadn't been a prank. It hadn't even been something to glorify. Exulting in his life while Barton and all those auras were dead seemed rude somehow. And the other thing, transfiguring a friend to confuse everyone. He knew he hadn't done that. He could, of course. Transfiguration wasn't his best class for nothing. But why would he? But the thing that really nailed it, Modest. He was a heck of a Quidditch player, pretty brilliant, if he did say so himself, when it came to transfiguration, charms, defense. He didn't lack for bravery, and as for looks. It was obvious to practically everyone that James had a lot of virtues, but modesty wasn't one of them. They had to have the wrong guy. They had to. Took you long enough. The fireworks didn't catch, did they? Sirius asked as James plopped down at his usual seat at the Gryffindor table. It took a moment for James to figure out what Sirius was talking about, remembering now the reason he had stayed behind. No, but keep water away from my trunk. You never know what could be in there. You all right, James? Remus asked, looking at his friend closely. James frowned down at his plate. You guys know Hogsmeade? He asked softly. Little village, south of the gates? Sirius asked, feigning humor. Remus and Peter, however, looked a little startled. James and Sirius hadn't spoken much of what happened when they had been out in the street. They'd been curious, but it hadn't seemed right to really pry given the way both boys seemed uncomfortable with the event. You know, the attack, James pressed, sidestepping Sirius's joke. Sirius froze. What about it? He asked just as quietly. I didn't do anything. Odd, did I? Sirius shared a glance with the others. No, not really. Course, don't know if I'd be able to tell. Never really fought any evil, dark blokes with you before. Unless you count Slytherins. But I didn't almost beat the Dark Lord, did I? James asked, his voice even more quiet. Peter had to strain to hear. Sirius chuckled. Having delusions of grandeur again? He asked, smirking. That's almost as funny as the time you thought you were Hogwarts's most eligible bachelor. I am, James said. But seriously, if I didn't do anything, well, extra special, let's say, why is it I was mobbed by auras and reporters just a minute ago? You were? Remus asked, his brows crinkling in thought. Yep, they were after giving me an order of Merlin. Took my picture so many times I'd gone blind, James exaggerated, but with good reason. He reached across the table and dished out some pudding, dropping it onto his plate with an emphasis that left splatters on the tabletop. Sirius leaned back. Well, how do you like that? Annoyance seeped into his words. I did just as much as you, more even. I beat an unforgivable, and you get the glory. Hey, James fumed, I didn't ask for this. I'm as confused as you. Why the hell would they think I nearly defeated Voldemort and saved Hogsmeade? Is there some sort of hallucinogenic potion in the water there or something? Hey, just joking, Sirius said, raising his palms. Got you. Why aren't you happy about this? Remus asked with a raised brow. You usually like the attention. Blunt, very blunt, Sirius added. Peter turned to glare at Remus. Yeah, James isn't, but true, Sirius finished, ignoring Peter's attempt at defending James. James opened his mouth to argue, but Moony had a good point. It was a little out of character. He bit into his shepherd's pie but it tasted dry. House elves must have been losing their touch. Don't know, he said lamely, just seems wrong, I guess. I mean, someone must have. But who? And why didn't we see him? Sirius asked. James shook his head. Anyone else think, strange, is starting to seem normal? He asked. 3 nods met his statement. As the marauders silently returned to dinner, James wondered if his little chat with Dumbledore would clear things up, but he wasn't holding much hope. The Dumbledore he had seen walking with Filibuster didn't seem any more enlightened than James himself. He was rather glad when dinner was over. The food wasn't settling in his stomach right. Someone really needed to have a chat with the house elves. Where you headed, mate? Sirius asked when James took a left at the staircase leading to the common room. Dumbledore, he called. What did you do now? A new voice accused from behind them. James didn't even need to spare a glance to know that Lily's green eyes were flashing. It was odd that he hadn't noticed her behind him. Nothing, he said, rolling his eyes. He wanted to return with something more glib but he had more things to worry about than Lily Evans. He kept up his pace, hoping to reach Dumbledore's office before Filibuster had gone. Maybe they could clean this mess up before it got to the papers. All he had to do was say it wasn't him. They couldn't prove it was, because, for once, he was entirely innocent. Such was an utterly new experience when entering the headmaster's office. He gave the gargoyle a familiar nod as the guardian stepped aside to allow him entrance. Come in, Mr. Potter. Dumbledore's voice passed through the partially opened door and James took a breath before turning the knob. He looked around expectantly but a raw filibuster was gone. "Sir, I swear, I'm not what they say I am," he burst out before taking a seat. Saying the truth quickly would make certain that it was said. He didn't want to steal this person's glory for a moment longer. "Take a seat, Mr. Potter," Dumbledore said very calmly, as if a teenager had not just burst into his office and started yelling. As James took a seat, he wondered how often that happened to the headmaster. "Sir, I wasn't the one who fought Voldemort." "Well, not like they say I fought him." Dumbledore nodded very wisely. "Yes, I know. But what if you were the one who did what has been done?" The old man said, looking at James from behind crossed fingers. "What?" James was seriously thinking he needed to go to the hospital wing. Things were starting to make less sense. "But I'm not." He said this very slowly, supposing that perhaps Dumbledore hadn't heard him correctly. "Yes, but what if you were?" "Huh?" The headmaster leaned back in his chair and fixed James with a very focused stare. "There are plenty of eyewitnesses who claim you were the person they saw. And the Ministry, after experiencing a rather crushing defeat, is very comfortable in allowing some good to come out of this situation. The heralding of a brave young man, one who intends to someday become an Auror. You can see why this is appealing to them." "What do you mean?" "Just that. Perhaps you could be the hero of Hogsmeade, as the evidence suggests. But I'm not," James repeated, not certain if the old headmaster needed a trip to Madame Pomfrey, too. He was getting old. It was only a matter of time. James's own grandfather had died completely convinced that he was a teapot. Dumbledore looked distant, rubbing his forehead wearily. The wizarding world needs someone to look up to at the moment. The attack on Hogsmeade did exactly what Voldemort intended. It struck a wave of fear through the hearts of the wizarding world. Dumbledore looked at the young man. That was his purpose. He didn't require anything from it except the fear it created. All those lives wasted. James felt ill. And it worked perfectly. Dumbledore looked older than James had ever seen him. He rifled through the parchment on his desk, his spectacle-framed eyes picking out the words that had been written to him. "Parents have owled me, concerned that their children are not safe here." And then the students themselves. Dumbledore looked a little sad. "If by sending them away I could guarantee their safety, I would do so, but I still believe they would be safest here." James shifted guiltily in his seat. He hadn't considered all of that, he had just been upset about the lies being spread about him. Dumbledore looked up and smiled tiredly. "I suppose I was just hoping that maybe it was true. Even though I know it can't be." James met the old man's gaze and... Was there a challenge gleaming in those eyes? A subtle wink filled with silent communication. James rubbed his forehead, swallowing the tightness in his throat. A pit opened in his stomach as he struggled to understand. Was the great Albus Dumbledore asking him to lie? "If I wasn't the one," he started hesitantly, "the real hero will come forward. I'd look pretty stupid." The old man stroked his beard. "It's lucky that you appear to be the only candidate. It is very unlikely that anyone else will come forward." What does that old man know? James wondered silently. This was insane. This wasn't how this conversation was supposed to go. He was going to get this mess cleared up, and then laugh about the mix-up in the common room with his friends. He shouldn't be entertaining this insanity. There was no way that Dumbledore, the Dumbledore, wanted him to pretend this. Telling the truth was the right thing. Wasn't that written next to the Golden Rule or something? He shouldn't be thinking about how one simple little lie would. But it's a false hope, James said, jumping to his feet. I'm not their hero, I can't save them. It's not a false hope, Dumbledore said firmly. The future will be better, but only if we take the pains to make it so. James shook his head. He could see the logic, despite himself. By allowing them to hang this title over his head, there would be a chance that people wouldn't give up hope. And as cheap as their savior might be, perhaps one was better than none at all. I can't lie, James said softly. The headmaster bit his lip slightly and his eyes sparkled with mirth. I think Professor McGonagall may argue with you on that point, Mr. Potter. James fought to smile himself before letting the cheer drain from his features. Not about something important. I can't just take away from someone, something I didn't earn. James looked up, desperately hoping the headmaster would understand. The old man's eyes were twinkling, and as he gazed at James, his mouth stretched into a smile. You surprise me, the headmaster said softly. Why does everyone say that? James complained. Look, he said firmly, I know I'm not. I know I get into trouble and I break the rules. But I never lied about who I was. He shook his head in confusion. Not on purpose. I just didn't know yet. His old thoughts came back to him. It had all been planned out, who he thought he was going to be. An Aurora, saving people, fighting dark wizards. He had wanted the glory, the name, the pride that came from that. He had even wanted to be famous, to have people think he was brave. He hadn't imagined the duty involved, the sacrifice that came from putting the wizarding world's priorities above his own. But he knew it now, with a sudden clarity that couldn't be denied. And as he settled deep into the folds of his chair, he knew that he would bear this, carry out the charade of a hero as best he could. A prank, perhaps, one with good intentions. But it would never be what he had wanted, but because it was needed. It wasn't heroic. Telling the truth would be the really heroic thing to do. But it was right, and in doing what was right he'd be able to sleep at the end of day. Because he'd done all he could. You don't have to lie, Dumbledore said gently. He had risen from his chair while James had been working out his thoughts. He placed a hand on James's shoulder. Sometimes saying nothing will suffice. Let them believe what they must. James nodded. Is this right? He asked. Somehow he wanted the headmaster to say it, as if it would take the responsibility away. It is a difficult path to walk, Dumbledore stated. James nodded. You will find, James, that there comes a time in life when we must choose between what is right, and what is easy. I am only sorry that this war brought your time so soon. James didn't feel too comforted by Dumbledore's twisting of words, but he nodded. Oh, and James, before you go. Lemon drop.